Hello dear students, welcome to our first online lesson. So it's been a while since we last met each other, so let's try to revise something for today, but let's start with other subjects. Let's start with history. I know that you learned a lot about old Greeks, old Romans, some other really powerful people, some emperors and etc. So I was thinking, I just want to ask you, what makes these people so powerful? Like, how do you know everything about like Roman Empire, for example? How do you know anything about them? How do you know that they were so powerful? In the past, for example, people fought with their swords, and then later they invented guns, cannons, so many much powerful and stronger weapons. And I want to ask you, what do you think is the strongest weapon in the world? How you know about those people? For example, old Romans, like they lived so many years ago, and this empire doesn't exist at the moment, but you still know that, you still learn in the history, you still know much about those people, you know all these old ancient philosophers, for example. What do you think is the strongest weapon in the world? Well, my answer is very simple. This is stories. People who write stories. People who write autobiographies, who write biographies, who write about other people, who write stories, fairy tales, myths, and etc. And because of those writers, you know a lot about old Greeks, about old Roman Empire, and that's how you know what people invented in the past. That's how you know how it all happened. So I remember when we first met in September, do you remember I asked you to write a short story, some narrative story about anything you wanted, and I read pretty nice stories actually. Then we've been writing so many essays, so many stories, so many fairy tales, novels, etc. And when I read last one, actually like the homework I gave you last week about The Little Prince, even though you haven't read the book, but I ask you to think what the folks want to tell to the prince. So like I read pretty nice ideas. So that's why I decided for today to just revise the storytelling, writing. So I'm pretty sure you know everything about the story structure. Am I right? For example, the storyline looks like that. So you start with the introduction. Then we have inciting incident, rise in action. Then there is a climax, which is the story's most intensive moment. And there is a resolution, when everything is clear what happened. So that's a story structure, right? So obviously you know that, of course. You know how to write an introduction, then you start the story, you write a really interesting stories, then there's a moment when everything becomes so interesting, and then everything becomes clear, and then finally you finish the story. It's really nice. However, let's try to improve it. Before we even start writing, we need to think about something. For example, let me give you an example. Tell me, who remembers this one? Do you remember that? In our classes we used her quite often. You might remember her name. In most of the classes, in almost every class, we call her Jane, right? Age, of course, her age was different in different classes. In some occasions she was 13, up to 24, I guess, as I remember. Actually, those stories and everything just writing right now, it's your own ideas. You told me about that. Also about her profession, for example. As we remember, she was a student and she was studying. In most of the cases, she was a doctor, as I remember. Plus, if you remember, you also told me that she's got a pet. Well, my drawings are not really professional, but anyway, you remember the name of the dog, I guess? His name was Max. So my question to you, everything that I drew on the board, or everything I'm just drawing right here, Max and Jane, everything that we together created about them, who are they? In this case, Jane and Max, they're called characters. So we together created new characters. You created everything about them, all the story, all the information, everything about her job, about her profession, her life, about the dog. If you remember when we were writing about dog's feelings, how he felt when he was alone, etc. and etc. So all this information you created. So that is called creating new characters of a story. So when you create a new character of a story, then you need a story, of course. However, before we do that, we definitely need to create a situation when this whole story takes place, which is called setting. Setting can be a house, can be a garden, can be a street, it can be anything where the story is happening. So mainly our setting was at home, but it can be anything, wherever the story is happening. And once we finish that, obviously we need to make a story. So the stories exist in many different ways, of course. It can be a short story, it can be a novel, it can be a fairy tale, biography, also called biography. It can be different genres. So who remembers what kind of story was this Jane story? We didn't really create anything about her, like any short story, any novel. We just looked through her life and we just revealed some important elements of her life and her decisions, of course, that changed her life. So that was our biography, but obviously biographies are much bigger and much longer, and it contains lots of detailed information. But in our situation, we just created something short that was necessary at the moment. However, it doesn't matter what kind of story we're writing, we still need to use some specific vocabulary and some elements that are very important for storytelling. And one of the most important elements of a story writing is figurative language, which is metaphors, similes, and imagery. So let's start with the difference between metaphors and simile, which you obviously know. So let's create two different sentences. For example, so this is one of my favorite books that is about the boy who traveled on a wild goose, and he was really brave. So he was really brave that he did that. So what is the bravest animal in the world, for example? Like, let's say lion, okay? So if you say Niels is a lion, which is that? It's a metaphor. If you write Niels is brave as a lion, then it's a simile, because if you use as or like, that creates a simile. Okay, so then we have imagery. So for imagery, that's everything, all the visualization that you use to make people imagine the character that you create. So for example, about the Jane, the same story that we did on the board, everything we created, there was imagery. Her appearance, her age, her hobby, her animals, her way of traveling to work or college every day, like everything we knew about her driving skills and her driver's license, and everything that we created, everything we were talking about, everything is imagery. So when you tell the story to someone else, they can create it in their head, so they know what you're talking about and they can imagine in their own mind. So whenever you read a book, there are always description of characters in order for you to imagine those characters. That's the main reason. So once we create the characters, we create a setting, we create a story, we know everything about the characters, we create the imagery, and then we need a story. So all this introduction and then raising the tension and everything, that is called narration. So when we narrate the story, we need to use some vocabulary that gives us the idea what will happen next. So when we write a narrative story, we need to use some specific vocabulary. Let me give you an example. I'm sure all of you are familiar with Google Maps. It doesn't matter if you walk or if you drive or if you take public transport, it doesn't matter. Whenever you use Google Maps, the Google gives you specific instructions, right? For example, if you're driving and you have to make a U-turn, it gives you this kind of sign. Or if you have to make a right turn, it gives you the sign. Or if you're going to turn left, obviously it will give you this kind of sign. So it will show you in advance that you're going to make a turn. But if you observed and if you paid attention before, Google never gives you this kind of sign just right when you have to make a right, just at the moment of making a turn. Obviously not. It will tell you in advance. For example, let's say 500 meters earlier or something like this, it will tell you to slow down because you're going to make a right turn at the next traffic lights, for example. So all these things that Google does, those are called, well, instructions of course, but in academic language we might call them discourse markers that will give you in advance the idea what will happen next. So when Google tells you to slow down, you slow down and you know that now something will happen next. So in the stories, it is the same situation in a story. When you write a story and when you use some specific vocabulary, some specific linkers, the readers, all the people who read your story or who listen to your story, they will realize, okay, so next this will happen. So we know that we're writing this, and then after that this will happen. So all this vocabulary, everything I've already sent to your Google Classroom before. So what you have to do is you have to open it, read it again, and for the next homework, so you're going to write a fictional story using these linkers and discourse markers. So for your homework, I'll send you this homework to your Google Classroom as well. So you're going to write a short story. I'll send you the instructions. You need to use all this structure, all this story structure, all these devices, all the discourse markers, and create really nice, interesting story which has proper characters, imagery, setting, and really nice plot. So main objective of the homework is to make it interesting. That's all I need. Make it interesting, make it nice to listen to. If you are interested in your story, other people will also be interested in that. That's it for today. Thank you for listening and see you in the next class.